Okay, so this video is just going to be kind of reviewing some of the textbook's concepts of family and different levels of family and different ways of parenting. I'm also kind of, like I said, briefly discuss the parenting styles and um, yeah. So first off, start with what family is. Family is defined as any two or more individuals living together who are related by birth, marriage, or adoption. There's different levels to being a family though, so there's like the nuclear family and the extended family. Nuclear family is like the immediate family. So for me, it'd be like my siblings, my mom, stepdad, and my dad. Whereas there's like the extended family, which is kind of everybody else. Cousins, stuff like that. Cousins, grandparents, all that good stuff. So it said that 1/3 of families in America today are single parent families. This is kind of how I grew up for several years of my life. So I guess we'll kind of start there, discussing living arrangements, right? So uh, single parent families, they're kind of interesting because they pose some risks that two parent families don't necessarily have. For example, poverty. Um, with the house only having one singular source of income, it's clear that poverty can be a serious threat. Uh, it's dangerous. Poverty is so dangerous because it can. There's several different ways that it can affect the development of children. Just go into a couple. Like um, it said that 1/5 of children in the U.S. live in poverty, with Black and Hispanic children being the most likely of all individuals to live in poverty. Um, the impact of poverty, it's like it can come up before the child is even born. For example, like um, if the individual who's pregnant cannot provide necessary nutrition levels or health services for the child, that can kind of cause some problems in the development of the child. Also, um, it's been shown, research has shown that living in a poor community where it's consistently loud and it's really crowded and it's just substandard living, um, and has been linked to a lot of behavioral issues. Those are just a couple of the ways that poverty can affect children. Um, and of course, we're talking about single parent families. We got to talk about divorce, right? So divorce is it's been proven that it does have different effects on children at different age levels. Um, I wasn't a part of a divorced household personally. Earlier, I know earlier I talked about I briefly mentioned my stepfather. So my parents are separated, but they're not. They've never been officially married. Just kind of give you guys a little more background about myself. Um, so infants and toddlers, they've been proven to show signs of attachment, security when divorce occurs. They don't really understand. But uh, this can like occur like at the time during the time of the divorce. Because they're going back and forth between the different parents and whatnot. But it can also carry over into the future. It's been shown to been common for it to show effects in the long term. But this all just depends on the custody arrangements of the child and how that situation plays out, because it can go really poorly or it can go really well, right? Preschool age, it's common for children to develop anxiety because they don't totally understand what's happening in the household. Sometimes it can even feels it's like it's their fault. Um, this is also kind of the case for school age children, right? Just a few years older, uh, and even then, uh, adding on to feeling as though it's their fault and the anxiety, it's also been depression is pretty common. Moving on to adolescence, which, if you don't know, adolescence is just your teenage years. It's very common to see behavioral issues, excuse me, as opposed to cognitive issues. This includes, of course, not limited to delinquent behavior or even like substance abuse. In the end, the most important thing when it comes to divorce, if you're going through a divorce or anything like that, the most important thing to think of is constructive conflict. Uh, Constructive conflict is like family conflict that's resolved in a positive way using affection, problem solving, and emotional support. Right. So this is the best way to go about it. When it's handled through constructive conflict, then it doesn't have as negative of an impact on the children, and that's so important because much of how children handle like future relationships, like in this case, it's based on like a concept called scaffolding, which is when uh, if the parents show different tendencies in relationships, like based on like how something is handled, whether it be positively or negatively, like if they see constructive conflict, then they'll kind of act that way. If they see like negative behaviors in relationships, then they'll act that way. So that's kind of what scaffolding is, just children like building off of what they see their parents doing, just kind of like acting in that way as well. Another type of parenting is the non-custodial parent. So that's like after the divorce, right? The parent who doesn't end up with full custody, uh, and usually the child can only see them like limited times or maybe even under like supervision. In my case, this was my father. My father was the non-custodial parent, but um, and I think this is pretty common. Uh, is that I saw my dad every other weekend. I think that's a pretty common thing is to go uh, like the child will go see the non-custodial parent, like every weekend or every other weekend. Um, there's also co-parenting, which is it's just the sharing of responsibilities, of the child among several people. Like getting help from other family members, like grandparents. I know that was a big factor for me because, um, growing up with living mostly with my mom, there were some times where we lived with like my grandma, and she would kind of handle things with me while my mom was like doing work or stuff, or I would go visit my grandparents if we weren't living them sometimes, and they would just help out. So that's kind of what co-parenting is. There's also step families, which I kind of briefly mentioned earlier. I talked about I have a stepdad. It's simply like when one parent, um, one of the two parents already has a child, then the parent without the child becomes a stepfather, mother, or whatever the case may be. There's also adoptive families. There's two different kinds of adoption. Adoptive families is regular adoption, right, where the child goes with the family. That's just how it is. If a child's with the family for good. There's also like open adoption, which is when the children and their biological and adoptive families have access to each other. So like the so that way the excuse me, so that way the child can still kind of like see their adoptive families, um, or their biological families. I'm sorry. Finally, there's foster care families, which is it's like temporary placement of children in a family that is not their own because of unhealthy situations within their birth family. Um, Foster care families are interesting because they're typically like a government funded family or something like that where um, they're getting money, the family is getting money from the government in order to support these different children. They bring them in temporarily, like I said, just to get them out of an unhealthy situation or environment. So that's kind of like the different types of family. It's always good to just hear. I think it's always good to know like different types of backgrounds that people could have uh, grown up in, and just understand that like things aren't always one way, right? So it's always just important to know that maybe everybody didn't grow up the same way as you. Maybe they grew up, foster care or an adoptive family, something like that, right? Just to just to think about others and the way they came up. Um, so like I said at the beginning, talk about different types of families. Now I'll talk about parenting styles. Um, so there's like when it comes to parenting styles, there's like a bunch of different like short term like techniques, and then there's like the four main parenting styles. So I guess we'll start with the uh, short term techniques. There's inductive discipline, which is there's clear rules, clear communication, kind of explains how to fix the problem. There's self-oriented induction. So that's where the child is asked about their actions in order to trigger them to think about the issue and its consequences on their own. On the other hand, there's other-oriented induction, which is similar to self-oriented induction, except now the child has to think about how uh, the consequences and how it can affect someone else, like how their actions affect other people, right? Then there's command strategy. That's where the parent doesn't really have to tell them, hey, you do this, and this is gonna happen. They don't have to threaten them, right? But the child just kind of knows about they just kind of know the power that the parents have, and so they just tell them hey, don't do this, and the child just kind of respects that. There's also relationship maintenance. It's just like parents trying to keep a positive relationship with their child. There's love withdrawal. It's where the parent withholds their love until the child does what the parent is asking, right? So they kind of take something away in order to get something out of the child. Finally, we'll just wrap up with the 4 main parenting styles that are discussed in the book. The styles are authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and disengaged. So authoritative parents are parents who combine high levels of control with a good deal of warmth and encouragement, together with reasonable expectations and explanation of the parent's rule. It's kind of how I would define my parents. I feel like that's kind of the household that I grew up in. And there's authoritarian. This is where there's high levels of control and low levels of warmth, but the parents still expect high levels of compliance from the children. There's permissive parents who provide a great deal of warmth and acceptance, but few, if any, rules or restrictions. It's always that kid who you have to do whatever you want. That's probably his parents. Then finally, there's disengaged, which is the parents who they don't set any limits or rules for their children, are not emotionally connected with children. This kind of every time I think about disengaged parents, I always kind of flashback to foster care. I think that that's kind of how a lot of children end up in foster care. Yeah, so that's kind of my spiel about different levels of family and different types of parenting. I did this just to help explain to people that not everybody grew up the same way you did. Take into consideration these things. Maybe people grew up with disengaged parents and they ended up in foster care. And maybe they don't understand uh, certain things, right? Because they didn't have certain role models in their life. So yeah, thanks for watching.